Hey everybody, what's going on? Bahroo here, and today I have another episode of Best in Slot. In this series, we take a look at the different weapon types and try and find the top 5 most damaging of that weapon type. In the last episode, we went over shotguns, and in this episode, we're going to be going over the SMGs of Borderlands 2. Now, before we jump into number 5, I want to quickly thank everyone for the massive support you guys showed for the first episode. That was crazy. I'm glad you all enjoy it. But with that out of the way, let's jump into number 5. Alright, so starting off our list with number 5, we have the Plasma Caster of the Hyperion brand. Hyperion will give you the highest DPS, as well as giving you that increased accuracy when firing. What's good about the Plasma Caster is that it comes with a built-in 50% splash damage, which means if you have any sort of grenade boosts, either from Bar or say from Axton, you will get additional damage on your splash, which is really nice. Now going over to our DPS test, we will see that the Plasma Caster really is not that bad for taking out Bad Maul. And again, I have increased Bad Maul's health to the same amount that I did for the shotguns, so this will be on an increased difficulty, and as you can see, it does rip right through his health. And even though he's going to be putting up his shield, because of the splash damage, I will be able to hurt Bad Maul even after he has put his shield up, and I'll just come over here and quickly finish him off. Overall, not a bad SMG, highly accurate, and good with dealing with enemies that have shields in front of them. And finally, going over the parts that you're going to want, obviously you're going to want the Hyperion brand of Plasma Caster. You're going to want a dull stock, and the sight is irrelevant. For the prefix, you're going to want proactive or the accelerated. The reason you're going to want this is even though it has a high rate of fire already, it is a Plasma Caster, so the projectiles are kind of slow. So having that accelerated will boost that up a bit. Or if you have velocity, then maybe you can go for damage. Either way, let's go ahead and jump into number 4 now. So for number 4, we have the Bitch SMG. Yes, this SMG coming back from Borderlands 1 makes it into our top 5. Now, as we can see, the body damage isn't as high as the Plasma Caster, and that is simply because of the 50% extra splash. However, the critical damage does start to take over, as you can see that it will out DPS it once you start getting those criticals. So for criticals, you're going to want to go with a Bitch. If you end up just body shotting, then maybe a Plasma Caster, but either way, let's jump over to our DPS test and see how this SMG performs. Now, against Bad Maul's shield, the Bitch is not going to be able to do any sort of damage at all, but as you can see, I almost take him out in a single phase lock just because of all of that extra critical damage. I'm trying to hit his feet, but unfortunately I can't do anything except for just sort of wait for another phase lock to happen. And again, with the body shot damage, the Plasma Caster can out DPS the Bitch, but with once the criticals start to kick in, you're going to do more. Anyway, as far as parts go, you're going to want dull stock as always. Dull stock is pretty much the standard for pretty much any gun, especially for dull since you get an extra burst in the clip. You're going to want the Hyperion grip, and sight is irrelevant, and again you're going to want accelerated because the rate of fire definitely is awesome, and although the projectile speed doesn't really hurt, it is always nice to have. I always prefer fast projectile speed since the Bitch can fire at very long ranges. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into number 3. And as we can see in number 3, the SMG is a bandit, and it is the Bone Shredder. Now this would have ranked higher, however, its accuracy is not that great and is going to be a pure close encounter type SMG. As we see in the DPS test with Bad Maul, that you're gonna pretty much need to be at point blank range to get the full critical amount out of this SMG. However, it does actually shred up Bad Maul fairly easily, which was the part that I was kind of surprised about. If you have point blank range, go for it. If not, I wouldn't recommend it. Yeah. But as far as parts go, you're going to want dull stock, bandit grip, sight again is irrelevant, and you're actually going to want the stopping prefix on this one because the stopping prefix slightly out DPS's the faster rate of fire, which is it's next to nothing really. But anyway, moving on with number 2. And for number 2, we have the Sandhawk. Now, number 2 and number 1 were so close that I almost wanted to tie the two, but in the end, the number 1 SMG does end up having more damage output over a short and long period of time, so it did end up winning. But for number 2, compared to the Bone Shredder, you can definitely see that it definitely beats it out by quite a bit and is a lot more accurate, which is something that the Bone Shredder was definitely lacking. And if we move over to the DPS test, then we will see that Badmaw is pretty much going to get destroyed in just a couple of seconds, because it is still a Sandhawk, and even though one gun beats it, it makes very short work of him. And now, before we go over the parts, I do want to make a quick note on the Sandhawk, is that it is extremely accurate even at very long ranges. So the next gun, we'll be doing a couple more tests after we go over it. But let's quickly go over the parts for the Sandhawk. You're going to want the flying prefix because the Sandhawk does have slower projectiles. You're also going to want pretty much dull parts on everything minus the sight, because that has no effect on any sort of stat. So you're going to want dull grip and dull stock. These are important because it adds +1 to the burst, which will definitely have a huge hit on your DPS if you do not use those two parts on it. Anyway, moving on to the number 1 SMG. And now for our number 1 SMG, we have the Taddler. Now, as we can see, this thing just barely beats out the Sandhawk in DPS, but when we go over to the test, you'll see that it, because of the fact that it doesn't have to reload to get its kills, definitely helps it in these sort of DPS tests. And overall, it's not a bad SMG at all. If this thing could have a prefix other than bladed, it would take the top spot without any challenge, because it's missing accelerated or potentially the murdering prefix for the extra damage. So let's quickly go over to the damage test here, and we'll see that it is easily comparable to the Sandhawk SMG. It has no problems at all taking out Badmaw in just a couple of seconds, which I was actually kind of surprised by. And we can see that even after we've killed Badmaw, we still have like almost 50 bullets left in the magazine, and this is where the Taddler starts to shine, is that it doesn't have to get those reloads in to get its kills. And as far as damage per ammo spent, this is the most efficient weapon in the game for SMGs. So that is another bonus that it has going for it. But before we go on to our final test with these two SMGs, I wanted to quickly say that the parts that you're going to want for this obviously is going to be the Bandit Grip with the dull stock. You're also going to only have the option of having a bladed prefix. The Taddler cannot spawn with any other prefix other than bladed, and again, the sight is kind of irrelevant. So let's go ahead and move on to our final test here. So for our final test, we're going to be testing out the spreads of the Taddler and the Sandhawk at short, medium, and long distance ranges. Obviously, at the short distance, neither of these SMGs are going to have issues. Their spreads are basically identical. The Sandhawk is actually a little bit wider, so it might be a little bit harder to hit skinnier enemies, but there is one thing to note, is that at near point blank range, the Sandhawk actually only hits one pellet. So if you're in a point blank range type situation, the Taddler will not have any issues hitting all 3 of its pellets because they don't have a minimum range. Moving on to a more medium style range, we notice that the Taddler spread starts to widen quite a bit here, and again, it might start be a little bit harder to hit skinnier enemies like the regular Marauders. The Sandhawk, its spread pretty much stays exactly the same as the short distance. Not really too much increase there. It's a little bit taller now on the spread, but overall, both SMGs won't have any sort of issues hitting the enemies. Now, if we go to what I consider to be a long range for an SMG, we'll notice that the Taddler is going to start falling off right about at this range because, granted, both the Taddler and the Sandhawk are going to miss at this range, but the Sandhawk is definitely has a much tighter spread. So at this range, you're going to have a slight issue. But if we move over to the Sandhawk, again looking at the Tattler spread, and we fire our Sandhawk, again we're still going to miss a couple of shots at this range because the spread is a little bit all over the place, but it's still pretty tight compared to the Tattler. So at long range, the Sandhawk does end up winning, but at short to medium range, you're going to want to use a Tattler, assuming you're not using a B to go along with your SMG. Obviously, if you use a B, the Sandhawk wins because the projectiles are not listed. But yeah, that should clear up as to at which point the Tattler just starts to drop off. And before we end this video, I wanted to go over a couple of honorable mentions because people wanted me to go over a couple of SMGs that just didn't make the list. So let's go ahead and quickly go over those. So the first one on our list is the Florentine. This one did not make the list because its splash is all slag, so any grenade boosts are going to go into slag damage, which doesn't really help it at all, as well as it only being shock. You won't be able to get any sort of real elemental multiplier for using against flesh or armor. So overall, this one it can't compete with just a regular plasma caster, assuming you're using slag. Moving on to the Actualizer, this one lost to the plasma caster as well. It's a solid SMG for sure, but its long reload and its lack of splash damage ended up hurting it in the overall DPS tests. Not a bad SMG, but overall just couldn't make the top 5, which is kind of unfortunate. Moving on to our next one, we have the Hellfire. Now, this one I wanted to be in the top 5. It does get an honorable mention, but it only being fire only definitely hurts it quite a bit because that really limits on what you can use this SMG on. Also, its increased dot damage and elemental effect chance are completely wasted on this SMG because in OP8, enemies will regen out of that sort of dot damage, so it just didn't make the cut. And then finally we have the Lascaux, again another solid SMG, but this one suffers greatly from just not having an element. This one would be contender for at least top 3 if this thing could have an element, because once you throw in elemental relics which have multiplicative 40% damage, this thing drops off very quickly, which is kind of unfortunate, but overall not a bad SMG. But anyway, that's pretty much going to wrap it up for this video. I want to thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this. If you did, be sure to hit that like button, help support me in what I do. And don't forget to leave a comment down below on what class of weapon you would like me to go over next. And I will see you on the next video. Later.